Eleanor Ashford pressed her trembling fingers against the ballroom door and breathed. Just breathed. Because 6 months ago, she couldn't. 6 months ago, her sister had handed her a cup of chamomile tea with a smile too sweet to be trusted, and Eleanor had nearly died believing it was love. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was walking in anyway. If this story touches something in you, subscribe and follow Eleanor to the very last word. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Eleanor Ashford had spent the better part of her 24 years learning how to disappear. She had perfected the art of it. The way you could stand at the edge of a room full of people who knew your name and still feel like the space you occupied belonged to someone else. The way you learned to fold yourself smaller, quieter, thinner in presence if not in form, until the eye simply passed over you, the way it passed over a cracked vase that had been moved to the back of the mantel because someone more beautiful had taken its place. Tonight, she was done with all of that. She stepped through the double doors of the Hargrove estate's grand ballroom, and she did not look down. Her chin was level, her shoulders were back. Her hair, thin, fine, refusing to hold the curl her mother's maid had tried 3 times to pin into it, sat braided close against her neck, and she wore it like a woman who had decided it was enough. It had taken her the better part of 6 months just to get to standing upright. The ballroom was already full when she arrived. Candles threw gold against the walls. Summer heat pressed through every cracked window despite the evening hour, and the women of Virginia's finest families moved through it all like they had been born comfortable. Silk skirts catching the light, throats adorned with their mother's jewels, laughter ascending in bright, practiced arcs. Eleanor stood at the edge of all of it and breathed. "You made it." She turned. Her mother, Margaret Ashford, stood 3 feet away with the rigid posture of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in the carriage and intended to execute it flawlessly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Eleanor asked. Margaret's eyes moved over her once, quick, assessing. "I think you look pale." "I was ill, Mother, 6 months ago." "Yes." Margaret straightened the lace at her own wrist. "Well, you're here now." That was the whole of it. "No, I'm glad you recovered." "No, I was frightened, Eleanor. I didn't know if you'd come back to us." Just "you're here now," like a room that had been rearranged while she was absent and was simply expected to resume its original function. Eleanor turned back toward the room. "Where's Genevieve?" "She's already dancing." Margaret's voice warmed noticeably, the specific warmth that only her younger daughter seemed to draw from her. "She's been the talk of the evening. Mrs. Hargrove herself said she outshines every young woman in the county." "Lovely," Eleanor said, and she meant it less than she ever had. She found Genevieve on the far end of the floor, exactly where she expected her, at the center of a circle of young men who were, to a one, absolutely captivated. Genevieve Ashford had that particular kind of beauty that functioned like gravity. Dark curls pinned high, eyes that caught the candlelight and held it, a laugh that arrived at precisely the right pitch to make every man nearby feel individually chosen. She was wearing the ivory gown. Eleanor's jaw tightened once, and then she released it. The ivory gown had been a gift from their father before he died. Not to Genevieve, but to Eleanor, who had been 14 and standing in the dressmaker's doorway when he'd said, "That one, for my Ellie." He had died 3 months later, and the gown had been altered twice before Eleanor ever had occasion to wear it. It had been sitting in her wardrobe last autumn when the fever came, and by the time Eleanor had recovered enough to open that wardrobe again, the gown was gone. She had not asked where it went. She already knew. "Miss Ashford." She turned at the voice. A young man she vaguely recognized, Thomas Hale, second son of somebody important, was bowing at her elbow with a polite, slightly uncertain smile. "Mr. Hale," she said. "You've recovered well," he said. "We were all, that is, the family was. We heard it was quite serious." "It was," she agreed. "You look—" He hesitated, searching for the word that would be both honest and kind, which was its own particular form of cruelty. "You look well," he finally settled on. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." He asked her to dance. She accepted, because it was easier than explaining that she hadn't come here tonight for dancing. She'd come because 6 months of a sick room had taught her that the world would not pause on her account, and if she was going to live in it, she needed to walk back into it before she convinced herself she couldn't. The dance was unremarkable. Thomas Hale kept decent time and said nothing of consequence, and Eleanor was grateful for both. It was over his shoulder, mid-turn, that she first saw Benedict Hawthorne. She recognized him from reputation before she recognized him in person. There was not a drawing room in Virginia that summer where his name had not come up at least once. The Duke of Hawthorne returned to his family's American estate after 5 years in England, a man who had reportedly not attended a single social event since his return 3 months prior. He was, by most accounts, reclusive to the point of rudeness, which the women of Virginia's social circles seemed to find both offensive and aggressively interesting. He was standing near the far wall, apart from the crowd, holding a glass he hadn't drunk from. He was taller than she'd imagined from the stories, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a kind of angular face that looked like it had been made for disapproval. He was watching the room with the expression of a man enduring something. He was not watching Genevieve. Eleanor noticed that immediately, because almost every other man in the room was watching Genevieve, and Benedict Hawthorne was facing entirely the wrong direction for it. His gaze was moving through the ballroom with the slow, methodical quality of someone searching for something specific, and when it landed on Eleanor, it stopped. She looked away, forced herself to attend to Thomas Hale's commentary on the summer heat. When she looked back, Benedict Hawthorne was still watching her. The dance ended. She returned to the edge of the room. Genevieve appeared at her elbow within minutes, flushed from dancing, gorgeous in the ivory gown, bringing with her the particular energy of a woman who had been the most admired person in the room, and knew it. "Eleanor." Her voice was warm. It was always warm. That was the thing about Genevieve. She was never overtly cruel, never sharp enough that you could point to the wound and say, "There, that's where it came from." She simply arranged things. She simply found them. "I'm so glad you felt well enough to come. Truly. You look—" A small, affectionate pause. "Rested." "Rested," Eleanor repeated. "Well, you've had time to be." Genevieve tilted her head. "The gown suits you, by the way. The green. It's very nice for your coloring." The ivory gown moved as she spoke. Eleanor watched it. "Thank you," she said. "Are you eating enough?" Genevieve touched her arm briefly. "You look thin, Ellie. I worry." "I'm perfectly fine. Mother says you refused to eat for nearly a week at the worst of it." Genevieve's brow creased with practiced concern. "I felt so helpless being in Richmond when you were—" "You were in Richmond," Eleanor said simply. "I remember." There was the briefest flicker across Genevieve's face. Then the warmth returned, smooth and immediate. "Well, I'm here now, and so are you." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Come find me later, won't you? I want to introduce you to the Hargrove girls." She drifted back toward the floor and the men waiting for her there, ivory silk trailing behind her. And Eleanor stood where she was and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that her sister had never, not once, expressed the slightest grief at the prospect of her dying. She had brought Eleanor chamomile tea every evening for 3 weeks before the fever broke. 3 weeks of, "Drink this, Ellie. It'll help you sleep." 3 weeks of sweetness that Eleanor had accepted gratefully, trustingly, the way you trusted a sister because the alternative was too terrible to examine. She did not know if it had been deliberate. She had decided, lying in the sick room in February with her hair falling out against the pillow, that she could not afford to know. What she knew was that she had survived. What she knew was that she was standing here, and the ivory gown was across the room, and she was done making herself small enough to disappear. "You don't look rested." The voice came from just behind her left shoulder, low and unhurried, and Eleanor turned to find that Benedict Hawthorne had crossed the room. He was closer than she'd expected. He still held the untouched glass. Up close, the disapproval she'd read in his expression from a distance resolved into something more precise. It wasn't displeasure, exactly. It was disengagement, the look of a man who had decided most of what surrounded him did not merit his genuine attention, and had not revised that assessment tonight. Until now, apparently. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "Your sister told you that you look rested." He wasn't apologetic about having overheard it. "You don't. You look like someone who fought hard to get to standing, and got here anyway." Eleanor studied him for a moment. "That's a strange thing to say to someone you haven't been introduced to." "Benedict Hawthorne," he said. "You're Eleanor Ashford. You were ill last winter. Your sister spent February in Richmond." He paused. "I had the account from Mrs. Hargrove before you ask. She speaks at some length about most things." "She does," Eleanor agreed, cautiously. "I'm not making conversation," he said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not standing here because it's expected of me, or because your mother is watching from across the room, and I ought to. I came over here because—" He stopped, seemed, briefly, to find the honest version of the sentence. "Because you've been standing at the edge of this room for 40 minutes, and you haven't once looked like you needed anyone to hand you a drink or tell you you're pretty." Eleanor blinked. "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment." "It is," he said, without ceremony. "Take it as one." She looked at him, really looked, the way she had been trained not to do with men she hadn't been formally introduced to, the way that was considered too direct, too much. He met it without blinking. "You haven't danced," she observed. "No. Mrs. Hargrove will consider that a failure of the evening." "Mrs. Hargrove considers most things a failure of the evening," he said. "I've made my peace with it." Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth move. "You came all the way across the room to tell me I don't look rested." "I came across the room," he said, "because I have spent the last 3 months attending exactly 0 of these events, and the one time I allow myself to be persuaded, the only person in this room behaving like an actual human being is standing against the wall trying to be invisible." He looked at her directly. "You're not invisible. I want you to know that." The words landed somewhere deep and undefended in her chest, and she hated it a little, how quickly they found the mark. "Mr. Hawthorne—" "Duke," he said, not with pride, but with the flatness of a correction he was tired of making, though I don't particularly require it. "Duke Hawthorne." She straightened slightly. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm quite capable of—" "I'm not rescuing you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You don't look like someone who needs rescuing. You look like someone who has already handled most of it on their own." He glanced toward the far end of the room, where Genevieve was now laughing at something a young captain had said. His expression did not change. "I just thought someone ought to say it plainly." Eleanor followed his gaze to her sister. "She's very beautiful," she said, watching him. "Yes," he said, without looking away from Eleanor. "She is." She waited. "So are you," he said. "That's not what I'm talking about." Eleanor's hands tightened once at her sides, and then she made herself release them. "You're very direct for a man at a summer ball." "I've been in England for 5 years," he said. "They're not direct there. I find I've lost patience for the alternative." "And what is the alternative?" He tilted his head toward the center of the floor, where conversations happened in layers, the surface meaning, and the actual meaning, and the 17 things that would be reported to someone's mother by morning. All of that, he said. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the nearness of it, how close she came to actually laughing, which she had not done easily in 6 months. "Would you like to dance, Miss Ashford?" he asked. She looked at him. "You just told me you don't dance." "I told you I haven't danced," he said. "Those are different things." Eleanor was aware, in a peripheral way, that her mother had spotted them. Was aware that across the room, Genevieve's attention had shifted, that the bright laugh had paused for just a fraction of a second. She was aware that this was the sort of moment that would be talked about. A man who had refused every invitation since his return, crossing a ballroom to speak to the Ashford girl, the plain one, the one who'd been sick. She was aware of all of it, and she found, standing there in the green gown that was not the ivory gown, that she did not care, even a little bit. "Yes," she said. "I'll dance with you." He danced well. She hadn't expected that. She'd half expected the discomfort of a man who'd promised something he couldn't deliver, the awkward apology of missteps. But Benedict Hawthorne moved with the quiet precision of a man who had learned a skill and applied it without needing to be admired for it. And Eleanor found herself following him without effort. "You're holding yourself like you're bracing for something," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "Force of habit," she said. "What are you bracing for?" She considered the honest answer. "The moment it turns out to be a joke," she said. His hand against her back tightened, just slightly. "It's not a joke." "I don't know you well enough to be certain of that." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He turned them, clean and unhurried. "But you're still dancing." "I'm still dancing," she admitted. "That's something," he said. Around them, she felt the room adjusting its attention. Conversations faltering and resuming. The specific quality of silence that happened when people were watching something they hadn't expected and couldn't yet categorize. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at Genevieve. She looked at the man in front of her, who had walked across a room because she looked like a person who had already survived most of it on her own, and said so plainly, without asking for anything in return. "What brought you back?" she asked. "From England." Something moved across his face, not pain exactly, but the place where pain had settled and been lived with long enough to become manageable. "My father died," he said. "The estate needed someone in it." "I'm sorry." "It was 2 years ago." He said it without the stiffness of someone deflecting sympathy. "I stayed in England longer than I should have. It felt easier to be elsewhere." "Easier than coming home?" "Easier than coming home to something that had changed," he said. "Everything looks the same and isn't. I find that harder than things that look different and aren't." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I know that particular kind of harder." He looked at her. "Your father?" "Among other things," she said. The music moved around them, and they let it, and neither of them said anything for a stretch that should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. "You don't have to be interesting," he said, eventually. "I want you to know that. You don't have to perform anything." "I wasn't aware I was performing." "You weren't," he said. "That's what I mean." Eleanor looked up at him. In the gold candlelight, with the summer heat pressing close, and the whole of Virginia's most important families watching them without watching them, she felt something shift in the place where she'd been holding herself rigid for 6 months. Not collapse, not surrender. Something smaller and more significant than either. Just the first loosening of a grip she hadn't known she was keeping. "Duke Hawthorne," she said. "Benedict," he said. "If you're willing." She considered that, the weight of it, First names at a summer ball, after one dance, with her mother 30 feet away and her sister's eyes in the back of her neck like a brand. "Benedict," she said. He didn't smile, but something in him shifted too, quiet and certain, like a door that had been standing open for a long time, finally admitting someone was going to walk through it. The music drew toward its close. They finished the dance in step, unhurried, without ceremony. When it ended, he held her hand for exactly the correct amount of time and no longer, and released it. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said back. He inclined his head, turned, and walked back toward the edge of the room, not toward the crowd, but along it. And she watched him go and understood with a clarity that settled quietly in her bones that Benedict Hawthorne had crossed a room full of people who wanted his attention and given it to exactly one person. Her mother appeared at her elbow within seconds. "Eleanor," her voice was low and rapid. "What on earth were you—" "Dancing," Eleanor said. "He asked. I said yes. He has not spoken to a single person this evening. He spoke to me." Margaret stared at her. Eleanor had not interrupted her mother since she was 12 years old. "He's a duke," Margaret said, as though this were a warning. "I know what he is, Mother." "Then you know that you ought to be. That a woman in your position shouldn't what?" Eleanor turned to look at her mother fully, and there was something in her face, in the set of it, that Margaret Ashford apparently did not recognize from her eldest daughter, because she stopped speaking. "I danced with a man who asked me. I will not apologize for it." Margaret closed her mouth. From across the room, Eleanor felt Genevieve watching her. She did not turn to meet it. She stood where she was, at the edge of the floor where she had been invisible for as long as she could remember, and she breathed, just breathed, and she was still there, still standing, still whole. Her mother walked away without another word, and that silence was louder than anything Margaret Ashford had said all evening. Eleanor watched her go, the straight back, the rigid shoulders, the way a woman could carry her disapproval like a second spine, and felt something strange settle in her chest. Not guilt. She had expected guilt. She had been raised on guilt the way other children were raised on Sunday sermons, and it had always arrived faithfully, right on schedule, whenever she committed the offense of wanting something for herself. It didn't come. What came instead was the particular quiet of a woman who had said a true thing out loud and survived it. She was still standing there, still sorting through the novelty of that feeling, when Genevieve arrived. Not rushed, never rushed. Genevieve moved through every room as though it had been arranged specifically for her arrival, and she approached Eleanor now with that same unhurried grace, the ivory gown catching every candle in the place, her expression arranged into something warm and slightly puzzled, the way a person looked when they were performing concern they didn't entirely feel. "Ellie," she touched Eleanor's arm. "What happened with Mother? She looked upset." "She was," Eleanor said. "What did you say to her?" "I told her I wouldn't apologize for dancing." Genevieve's brows lifted, a careful, measured fraction. "With Hawthorne." "With Benedict Hawthorne, yes." The warmth in Genevieve's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not gone, just recalibrated. "You're on a first-name basis already." "He offered it." "He offered it," Genevieve repeated, and there was something underneath the repetition, something that turned the words over slowly, the way you turned over a stone to see what was living beneath it. Eleanor, that's not something men like that do lightly." "I'm aware." "Are you?" Genevieve tilted her head. "Because I've been watching him all evening. Everyone has, and he hasn't spoken to anyone. He stood at that wall like he was serving a sentence, and then he walked across the room to you." A pause, perfectly timed. "I just want to make sure you understand what that looks like. What people will say." "What will people say, Genevieve?" "That you pursued him." The words were gentle, sisterly, like a hand pressing down on a wound while insisting it wasn't pressing. "That you positioned yourself deliberately. People are already talking, Ellie. Mrs. Whitmore was whispering to her daughter not 5 minutes ago." "Let her whisper," Eleanor said. Genevieve blinked. It was a real blink, this one, not performed. Her sister's patience had always been the thing Genevieve relied on, the soft ground she stood on whenever she needed to apply weight. Eleanor had given way every single time, had absorbed every quiet diminishment with the obedience of someone who believed she deserved it. "You're not yourself tonight," Genevieve said finally. "I think," Eleanor said, "that I might be more myself tonight than I have been in years." The silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Eleanor watched something move through her sister's face that Genevieve could not fully contain. Not hurt, not anger, but something colder and more strategic than either. Assessment. The look of a woman recalculating. Then the warmth returned, bright as a lamp turned up. "I'm glad you're feeling better," Genevieve said, and drifted away. Eleanor did not go looking for Benedict Hawthorne. She told herself that plainly as she accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing tray and moved toward the cooler edge of the room. She was not going to seek him out. She was not going to arrange herself in his line of sight. She was going to do what she had come here to do, which was simply exist in a room full of people who had written her off, and prove to herself that she could. She found a small group near the far window, the Hartley sisters, whom she had known since childhood, and their cousin from Charleston who was visiting for the summer. They received her with the cautious warmth of people who weren't certain how much had changed and didn't want to say the wrong thing. Eleanor made it easy for them. She asked about their mother's garden. She asked about the Charleston cousins' journey up the coast. She listened and responded and acted, for all the world, like a woman who was perfectly fine. She was almost beginning to believe it when she heard his voice. Not directed at her, across the room. Benedict had been drawn into conversation by the host, Mr. Hargrove, and 2 other men she recognized as county landowners. His voice was low and carried the same flat precision she'd heard on the dance floor, and even at a distance, it was distinct from every other voice in the room because it didn't perform. It just said things. The Hartley sisters noticed her attention shift. "He really did dance with you," said the younger one, Clara, not unkindly. "I thought I'd imagined it." "You didn't imagine it," Eleanor said. "No one is going to talk about anything else tonight," Clara said. "Or for the next month, frankly. He hasn't—" She lowered her voice. "He hasn't spoken to Mrs. Hargrove's own niece. She went over to introduce herself, and he said 4 words and looked away. 4 words, Eleanor. She counted them." "What were the 4 words?" the Charleston cousin asked, fascinated. Apparently, it was, "How do you do?" Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and felt Clara watching her with the particular attention of a young woman storing information. "He looked at you differently," Clara said. "During the dance. I was watching." "Clara," her older sister said. "I was watching everyone," Clara said, unapologetic. "It's a ball. Watching is the entire point." She looked at Eleanor with something genuine and direct that Eleanor found she was not prepared for from this particular corner of the evening. "You looked different too. Both of you did. Like you'd found the only other person in the room who was actually telling the truth." Eleanor set down her glass carefully. "That's a very perceptive thing to say." "I'm 17, Clara said. "I have nothing to do with these things but pay attention." It was 9:30 when the second dance was called. Eleanor was not on the floor. She was standing near the doorway that led to the Hargrove side parlor, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, when she heard footsteps stop beside her and knew without turning who it was. Miss Ashford. Duke Hawthorne. She turned, back to formalities. We're in public, he said simply. You can correct me if you like. Benedict, she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. Something in his expression settled. I had to speak to Hargrove for 20 minutes about crop rotation, he said. I want you to know that. Is that a complaint? It's context, he said. I haven't willingly discussed crop rotation since 1814, and I endured it because it was the only conversation between me and standing here again, and I wanted to stand here again. Eleanor looked at him. The directness of that, the plain, undecorated willingness to say, I wanted, landed in her chest with a force that was almost uncomfortable, because she had spent so long in a world where desire was packaged and performed and strategic, and he just said it like it was information. You could have simply walked over, she said. I could have, he agreed. But Hargrove had his hand on my arm, and I didn't want to be rude to the man in his own house. That's very considerate for someone with a reputation for rudeness. My reputation is for disengagement, he said. There's a difference. I'm not rude to people who deserve courtesy. I'm simply economical. Economical, she repeated. Is that what we're calling it? What would you call it? She considered. Honest, she said, which is rarer and more frightening than rude. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between recognition and something more careful. The way you looked at a door you hadn't expected to find unlocked. Would you walk with me? He asked. Not dancing, just... The parlor's quieter, if you're willing. She should have said no. She was aware, in some calm and distant part of herself, that she should say no. That the calculus of what people would say already ran in the direction of too much, and adding a private conversation in the side parlor would tip it into the kind of territory her mother would not recover from for the remainder of the season. Yes, she said. The parlor was not empty. Mrs. Whitmore was seated near the fireplace with two of her friends, which meant it was not a private conversation so much as a marginally quieter one. And Eleanor was surprised to find herself relieved. She didn't trust herself entirely, in this new version of herself, to know where all the lines were yet. Benedict seemed neither relieved nor disappointed. He simply adjusted, the way he seemed to adjust to most things. Not with effort, but with the quiet practicality of a man who had learned that most situations required only attention. They stood near the window. Mrs. Whitmore's group pretended not to notice them, which meant they were cataloging every word. Tell me about England, Eleanor said. Why? Because you spent 5 years there and came back and stopped speaking to people, she said. And that tells me something went wrong, but I don't know what. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone formulating a deflection, the working quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. I was engaged, he said. She had not expected that. In England? In England. To a woman whose family had been friends with my father's family for 30 years. It was, he paused, practical, is what my father called it. It was practical and sensible, and she was accomplished and kind, and it was absolutely the correct thing to do. But, Eleanor said. But she was in love with someone else, he said. She told me on the morning of what would have been our wedding. She sat across from me at breakfast and said that she respected me too much to go through with it, and that she was leaving for Scotland that afternoon with a man she'd loved since she was 19. He said it without bitterness. That was the thing that struck Eleanor most, the total absence of bitterness, as though it had been processed at some point and put down. I spent 6 months being furious. Then I spent a year being grateful. Then I spent another year trying to figure out what I actually wanted, which turned out to be harder than I expected. "And did you?" Eleanor asked. "Figure it out?" "I figured out what I didn't want," he said. "I didn't want practical. I didn't want the correct thing to do." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted someone who told the truth, who didn't arrange themselves, who didn't want something from me that had more to do with my title than with me." From across the room, Mrs. Whitmore coughed, which was the sound of a woman exercising extreme self-control. "That's a tall order at a Virginia summer ball," Eleanor said. "I'm beginning to think the odds are better than they looked an hour ago," he said. The words hit her somewhere low and certain, and she made herself breathe through it evenly rather than react the way she wanted to react, which was to believe him completely and immediately, which was exactly the kind of thing that got women like her hurt. "You don't know me," she said. "You've had 2 dances and half a conversation." "I know you wore a dress that isn't your best one tonight," he said, "because your best one is on your sister, and you haven't said a single word about it to anyone. I know you've been ill enough that it shows, and you're here anyway, standing straight. I know your mother said something dismissive to you within 30 seconds of your arrival, and you absorbed it and kept moving." He paused. "I'm not saying I know you. I'm saying I've been paying attention. There's a difference." Eleanor stared at him. "You noticed the dress. It was your father's gift," he said quietly. "Hargrove's wife mentioned it. She didn't mean to say something significant, but she did." The thing in Eleanor's chest that had been loosening since the first dance loosened further, and this time it frightened her, because it felt less like relief and more like exposure, like being seen in the specific place you had learned to hide. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know someone was paying attention," he said, "whether or not anything else comes of this evening." They were interrupted by Thomas Hale, of all people, who appeared in the doorway with the frantic energy of a man who had been sent by someone and was not entirely comfortable about it. "Miss Ashford," he was slightly breathless, "your mother is asking for you." Eleanor did not move immediately. "Is something wrong? She'd like you to come out. Now." He glanced at Benedict with the expression of a man who had been handed a task he wished he could return. "If you don't mind." Benedict's face did not change. "Miss Ashford," he said, quiet and even, "you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go." Thomas Hale looked as though the floor had shifted under him. "I know," Eleanor said to Benedict. She turned to Thomas. "Tell my mother I'll be out shortly." Thomas Hale opened his mouth, thought better of it, and went. "She'll be angry," Benedict said, not as a warning, just as acknowledgement. "She's been angry at me since February," Eleanor said, "since I survived the winter and didn't do it quietly enough." She heard herself say it and understood, in the moment of saying it, that she had never said it that plainly before, not even to herself, not fully. The anger her mother carried was not the anger of a woman who had feared losing her daughter. It was the anger of a woman whose arrangements had been disrupted, whose plans had been set back, whose preferred version of events had not proceeded as ordered. Benedict was very still. "Eleanor." "Don't," she said, before he could say something kind. I'm saying it plainly because that's what you said you wanted. People who told the truth. That's the truth." "I know it is," he said. "That's why I said your name." She looked at him. The candlelight from the parlor's small lamp sat on the angles of his face, and she was aware, suddenly and inconveniently, that he was very close, and that Mrs. Whitmore's group had gone entirely silent, in the way that meant they were listening with their whole bodies. "I should go to my mother," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. This was... She stopped. not certain what word completed that sentence honestly. Strange. Unexpected. The best 20 minutes she had spent in 6 months. It was, he said, as though he'd heard all 3 options. Miss Ashford. He inclined his head. I hope the evening improves. She walked back into the ballroom. Her mother was standing near the entrance, with the posture of a woman containing a volcanic event behind a pleasant expression. And beside her, which was the thing Eleanor had not anticipated, stood a man she had never seen before. Tall, with a wide face and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to. Dressed in the kind of clothes that announced money in every stitch. Eleanor. Her mother's smile was paper-thin. There you are. I'd like you to meet Mr. Arthur Colby. He's just arrived from Richmond. He's been asking about you specifically. Arthur Colby turned his smile on Eleanor with the particular quality of a man who had already decided how an evening was going to end. Miss Ashford, he said, taking her hand before she offered it. I've heard a great deal about you. Eleanor looked at her mother. Margaret Ashford's expression said everything that her mouth wasn't saying. This is what I want for you. This is what's possible for you. Stop making yourself difficult. From whom? Eleanor asked pleasantly. From your mother, of course, Colby said. She speaks very highly of you. He was still holding her hand. I believe we may have some mutual interests to discuss. Mutual interests. She knew what that meant. She had been a daughter in Virginia long enough to know exactly what it meant when a man appeared without warning and mentioned mutual interests while her mother watched with that specific expression. She had been in the parlor 20 minutes. 20 minutes, and her mother had already moved. Mr. Colby, she said, extracting her hand smoothly, I'm sure we'll have opportunity to speak later in the evening. She stepped past him, back toward the ballroom floor, and her heart was hammering in a way it hadn't all night. Not from the dancing, not from Benedict, not from Genevieve's quiet needling, but from the understanding that was settling over her with cold clarity. Her mother had not brought her here tonight to give her an evening. She had brought her here to arrange something. And the man in from Richmond, with his easy smile and his presumptuous hands and his mutual interests, had been in this plan long before Eleanor walked through the front door. She stood at the edge of the floor where she had started the evening, and she breathed. And she thought about a man who had crossed a room because she looked like someone who had already handled most of it on her own. She was going to need to handle considerably more. Arthur Colby did not take the hint. She had half hoped he would. She had stepped away from him with the quiet finality of a woman ending a conversation, and she had told herself that a man with even a moderate degree of social awareness would understand what that meant and redirect his attention elsewhere. There were plenty of other women in the room. Genevieve alone would have kept him occupied for the remainder of the evening without any effort at all. But Arthur Colby followed her. Not immediately. He gave it perhaps 4 minutes, which was exactly long enough to make the following feel casual rather than deliberate. And then he was beside her again at the edge of the floor, with that same wide, settled smile, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, as though he'd done her a service. I thought you might be thirsty, he said. Eleanor took the glass because refusing it would have been a scene, and she had already used her scene for the evening on her mother. Thank you, she said. Your mother tells me you've had a difficult winter. He said it with the ease of a man who believed that knowing a thing entitled him to say it. I'm glad to see you've recovered so well. People keep saying that, Eleanor said, recovered so well. Don't you think so? I think I recovered, she said. The so well tends to be other people's relief that I'm no longer inconvenient. Colby laughed, which was not the response she'd expected. It was a real laugh, too, not performed, not the polished social laugh of a man working to charm. He looked at her with something that might, in another version of this evening, have been genuine interest. "You're very direct," he said. "I've been told." "I like it," he said. "Most women in these rooms aren't." Eleanor looked at him fully for the first time. He was perhaps 35, well-made, with the hands of a man who had done real work at some point in his life, and the bearing of a man who had since learned he didn't have to. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. That was almost the worst part. "Mr. Colby," she said, "I want to be direct with you about something else." "Please," he said. "I don't know why you came to Richmond tonight." "I came from Richmond," he said. "I'm based in—" "I don't know why you came here tonight," she continued, without pausing. "Or what my mother told you. Or what you've been led to expect. But I want you to understand that whatever expectations were established before this evening, they were not established with my knowledge or my agreement." Colby's smile stayed, but it reorganized itself into something more careful. "Miss Ashford, I'm not being rude to you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm being honest. I'd rather you have the truth now than discover it later." He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she watched him reassemble his understanding of the situation. To his credit, he didn't bluster. "Your mother made certain implications," he said carefully. "I'm sure she did. That you might be open to—" "I am not," Eleanor said gently, "open to being arranged." The silence that followed was not hostile. That surprised her. She had expected hostility, or wounded pride, or the particular anger of a man who felt he'd been misled, which he had been, by her mother, though that was not Eleanor's fault, or her problem. What she got instead was a slow exhale, and then a nod, and then Arthur Colby looking sideways across the room, with the expression of a man who had just been sold a bill of goods and was recalculating his evening. "She was quite convincing," he said. "She generally is," Eleanor said. "I apologize," he said, "for the presumption." "It wasn't yours to begin with," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Colby." He inclined his head, and this time when she walked away, he didn't follow. Her mother found her in under 2 minutes, which told Eleanor that Margaret Ashford had been watching every second of that conversation from somewhere across the room, waiting. "What did you say to him?" Her voice was a whisper with the force of a shout behind it. "The truth," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, I told him I wasn't aware of any arrangement and wasn't party to one." She kept her voice level and her face forward. "He was gracious about it. You might have warned me he was coming, Mother. That would have been the honest thing. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react exactly like this. Like a person who has opinions about her own future? Like a stubborn, ungrateful—" Margaret stopped, collected herself with visible effort, pressing her lips together until the color left them. "Eleanor, Arthur Colby is from a good family. He has land. He has money. He came here tonight specifically because I told him that you would be—" "Available," Eleanor supplied. "Suitable," her mother said, and the word landed with its full weight, which was the weight of every year Eleanor had spent being told, in varying degrees of directness, that she ought to be grateful for whatever she was offered. "I'm going home at 10, Eleanor said. "I'll take the carriage. You and Genevieve can stay as long as you like." "You will not take the carriage and leave me here." "Then come with me at 10. She looked at her mother. "But I'm going." Margaret Ashford stared at her eldest daughter the way you stared at a wall you had been leaning on for years that had just decided to push back. Then she turned, very deliberately, and walked toward the Hargrove women on the far side of the room, and the line of her back said everything she hadn't finished saying, and Eleanor let her go. She was shaking slightly. She noticed it with some detachment, the way you noticed weather, not alarmed by it, just registering that it was happening. Her hands were steady, but her breathing wasn't entirely, and she pressed one hand briefly against her stomach and breathed through it until it was. "That," said Clara Hartley, appearing from somewhere to her left, "was extraordinary." "You saw that?" "I see everything," Clara said, unrepentant. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Eleanor said, and then, more honestly, "I will be." She did not look for Benedict. She was committed to that. She had told herself she was not going to seek him out, and she meant it more now than she had at the beginning of the evening. Because what she had just done, the Colby conversation, the confrontation with her mother, the claiming of the 10 o'clock carriage, all of that had been for herself, not for him. Not performed for the man who had said kind things in the parlor. For herself, because she had been done being arranged since February, since the sick room, since the moment she had understood that nobody in her immediate family had particularly needed her to survive. What she did was walk toward the quieter end of the ballroom, where the music was less deafening and the crowd was thinner, and stand near the window where a slight movement of air came through the crack in the frame, and breathe. She heard Genevieve's laugh before she saw her. Her sister had migrated toward this end of the room without Eleanor noticing, and she was standing in a small group that included, Eleanor registered with a slow and steady drop in her chest, Benedict Hawthorne. He had been recaptured, not by Genevieve specifically, not visibly, but the group had formed around Genevieve the way groups always did, and Benedict was inside it now, and Genevieve's laugh was doing what Genevieve's laugh always did, which was make every man in proximity feel that he was the specific cause of her happiness. Eleanor watched. She told herself she was not watching. She was standing near the window, cooling down, and she happened to be facing that direction. That was all. Genevieve said something Eleanor couldn't hear. The men in the group laughed. Benedict did not laugh, but he didn't move away either, and he was listening in that particular attentive way he had, the way that Eleanor had thought was directed at her specifically, and was now understanding might simply be how he listened to everyone, which was a different and more deflating thing. Then Genevieve touched his arm. It was brief, light, the kind of touch that could be called accidental by anyone who needed it to be accidental. Her hand on his sleeve for just a moment, accompanied by a look tilted up at him with the full force of everything Genevieve had at her disposal, which was considerable. Benedict looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His expression was unreadable from across the room. Eleanor turned away, pressed her palm flat against the window frame, and breathed, and told herself the thing that was happening in her chest right now was simply the predictable consequence of trusting the feeling too fast, of letting a few kind words in a candlelit parlor mean more than they were worth. She had done this. She had known better. She had been a sick woman in a green dress at a summer ball, and a man had said something true about her, and she had let it matter in the way that a woman who had been invisible for too long let things matter when someone finally looked. It was a lesson, that was all. She would take it and go home at 10 and be wiser for it. "Miss Ashford." She closed her eyes once, opened them, turned. Benedict was standing 3 feet away with the expression of a man who had walked with some purpose to get to where he was standing. There was no Genevieve. There was no group. There was just him and his untouched glass and that flat, steady attention. "You left the window," he said. "You were standing there, and then you weren't." "I was going to get some air," she said. "The window wasn't providing enough." "You looked at the group," he said, "and then you looked away." She met his eyes. "Were you watching me?" "I was watching you the moment I could see you again," he said, without any apparent embarrassment about it. "Your sister said something about you," Eleanor's chin came up. What did she say? She said you'd been much improved since your recovery. That you'd been... He stopped briefly. She said you'd been melancholy for years before the illness. That the sickness had perhaps clarified things for you. Melancholy, Eleanor said. That was the word she used. I was not melancholy, Eleanor said. I was quiet. There's a considerable distance between those two things. She paused. What was she doing telling you anything about me at all? That, he said, is exactly what I asked myself. He shifted his weight, almost imperceptibly. She also mentioned, incidentally, in passing, the way people mention things they very much intend to say, that you have a tendency to form attachments quickly, enthusiastically. He held her gaze. She said it the way a person says something kind while meaning something else entirely. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. She was warning you off, she said. She was trying to, he said. It didn't work. Benedict, I want to know what happened in the winter, he said. The gentleness in his voice had sharpened into something more direct, more urgent. Not the social version, not the recovered so well version. I want to know what actually happened. She looked at him for a long moment. The music played. Somewhere behind them, a woman's heels clicked against the floor. The summer heat pressed in from all sides, and Eleanor stood inside it and made a decision. I was sick for 6 weeks, she said. It started in December. By January, I couldn't keep food down. By February, I was... She stopped, found the even version of it. I was losing ground. The doctor came 3 times. He said it might be my constitution. He said some women were simply fragile. She heard the word with its full contempt. My mother prayed. My sister brought me chamomile tea every single evening and sat with me while I drank it. And she was very kind, and I was very grateful. And? He said. He had heard the "and" before she said it. And then my sister went to Richmond in February, Eleanor said. She was there for 6 weeks, and I stopped drinking the tea. And I started to get better. The silence that followed was very complete. Eleanor, he said, and it was not a question. I don't know, she said, before he could ask it. I want to be clear about that. I don't know. I never tested it. I never told anyone. I could be wrong. It could have been coincidence. She looked at him steadily. But I know what I know. Have you told anyone? Who would I tell? She said. My mother? She'd tell me I was being dramatic. A doctor? On what evidence? The tea is gone. Genevieve is my sister. She paused. She is still my sister. He was quiet for long enough that she became aware of the music again, and the voices around them, and the specific texture of a moment that was heavier than it should have been at a summer ball in Virginia. You came here tonight anyway, he said, knowing that. Knowing that, she confirmed. That's... He stopped. Started again. Eleanor, that's not stubbornness. That's the bravest thing I've heard this year. Or the most foolish, she said. Sometimes those are the same thing, he said. The ones worth doing usually are. She didn't hear Genevieve come up behind her. That was the part that would stay with her afterward. Not the words, not the expression on her sister's face when she spoke them, but the simple fact of how quietly Genevieve had moved, and how precisely she had timed it, and how entirely unprepared Eleanor had been. She had been standing with Benedict in the closest thing to safety she had felt all evening, and Genevieve had come in from the side like she always did, like she had always done, quiet and sweet and perfectly aimed. There you both are, Genevieve said. and her voice was the warm version, the sisterly version, pitched just right for carrying to the nearest cluster of guests. "I've been looking everywhere." Eleanor turned. Genevieve was standing close, too close, the way she sometimes stood when she wanted to make a physical point about proximity and possession. And her expression was serene, which was the expression Eleanor had learned to trust least. "We were speaking," Eleanor said. "I know, I didn't want to interrupt." A pause that was precisely long enough to establish that she had, in fact, interrupted on purpose. "Mother is asking for you again, Ellie. Mr. Colby apparently has something he'd like to—" "I've already spoken to Mr. Colby," Eleanor said. "We've concluded our conversation." Genevieve blinked. "He seemed to think—" "He was mistaken about what to think," Eleanor said. "And so was the person who arranged his expectations for him." It was as direct as she had ever been with her sister, in public, with witnesses. She felt it land. She watched Genevieve's serenity flicker at the edges, the warmth dimming by a precise and controlled degree, the way a lamp dimmed when someone turned the key. "Eleanor," Genevieve said quietly, "I think you're overtired." "I think I'm awake for the first time in a long time," Eleanor said. "There's a difference." Genevieve's eyes moved to Benedict. It was a look Eleanor had seen her sister deploy 100 times. Not at Benedict specifically, not ever, but the look itself was familiar. It was the look that said, "Whatever you think you know about her, I know more, and I will tell you all of it in the sweetest possible way at the first available opportunity." It was a look that had preceded the dismantling of every friendship Eleanor had formed since she was 16. Every potential connection. Every moment when something might have grown. Benedict looked back at her with the expression of a man who had already received one preview and was now watching the full version. "Miss Genevieve," he said, with a courtesy that was correct and entirely without warmth, "I believe your mother is near the entrance. You might let her know that Miss Ashford is in good company." Genevieve stared at him. No one talked to Genevieve Ashford that way. Certainly not men. Certainly not men who looked like Benedict Hawthorne and carried a title that Margaret Ashford would have sold considerable things to attach to her family. The smile stayed, because the smile always stayed. But behind it, something recalculated rapidly and came to a conclusion that turned her eyes colder for just a fraction of a second before she controlled it. "Of course," she said sweetly. "I'll let her know." She turned and walked away, and the ivory gown moved beautifully as she did. And she was the most graceful exit Eleanor had ever seen, and it had the energy of something that was not finished. "She'll go straight to your mother," Eleanor said. "Likely," Benedict agreed. "My mother will be over here within the minute." "Also likely." Eleanor looked at him. "You just made an enemy of my sister." "Your sister," he said with measured precision, "was already something considerably worse than an enemy to you. She just had better manners about it." Eleanor's throat tightened. She pushed through it. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I don't know it. But I know what I've watched this evening. I know what you told me in the parlor." He met her eyes steadily. "And I know that when a woman looks at the man speaking to her sister the way she looked at me just now, she is not looking at him like an enemy looks at someone. She is looking at him like a woman looks at something she intends to take away." Eleanor let that settle. Let the full shape of the evening reorganize itself in her understanding. Not as a ball, not as a social event, but as a series of moves on a board she hadn't known she was playing. Genevieve at the window with her group, drawing Benedict in. Genevieve's hand on his arm. Genevieve's soft words about Eleanor's melancholy. Eleanor's quick attachments. The warning off. And now this, the appearance in the exact moment that the conversation had turned to something real. "She heard us," Eleanor said slowly. "How much of it did she hear?" Benedict's jaw tightened. "Enough," he said. "I think she heard enough." Margaret Ashford did not arrive in 1 minute. She arrived in less than 45 seconds, which meant Genevieve had moved fast, and which meant the message she had carried was pointed. "Eleanor!" Her mother's voice was different now. Not the whispered fury of earlier, not the social performance. It was something flatter and more deliberate, the voice Margaret Ashford used when she had made a decision and was executing it. "I need to speak with you. Now." "Mother, I'm in the middle of—" "Now, Eleanor." Benedict straightened beside her. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, with the tone of a man accustomed to rooms deferring to him, "your daughter and I are not finished with our conversation." Margaret looked at him. She was not a woman easily overawed, but Eleanor watched the calculation move through her. The title, the land, the social weight of the man standing beside her daughter. And she watched her mother reorganize her approach in real time. "Duke Hawthorne." The warmth arrived so fast it was dizzying. "Of course, I apologize for the interruption. I simply—" She gathered herself, smiled, turned briefly to the nearest couple standing within earshot, smiled at them too, and then dropped her voice. "I need a word with my daughter in private. It won't take long." It was masterfully done. Eleanor had to give her that. One moment, a woman dragging her daughter away from a duke. The next, a concerned mother simply requiring a brief maternal consultation. The pivot was seamless. Eleanor looked at Benedict. "I'll be here," he said quietly, "when you're done." She followed her mother to the edge of the room, to the pocket of near privacy between the entrance hall and the ballroom floor, and she stood and waited. Margaret spoke very quietly and very clearly. "Genevieve tells me you said something to her. In front of him." "I said several things," Eleanor said. "She says you accused her of arranging this evening." "I didn't accuse her of anything," Eleanor said. "I said that someone had arranged Mr. Colby's expectations, and they had been arranged incorrectly. You humiliated her." "Mother." Eleanor kept her voice even by an act of will she would only appreciate later. "Genevieve is standing on the other side of this room, collecting the attention of every eligible man here. She is not humiliated. She is recalibrating." "Don't speak about your sister that way." "I love Genevieve," Eleanor said. "I have loved her my entire life. But I am done pretending that love is not complicated by some of the things she does." Margaret Ashford stared at her daughter, and Eleanor watched her mother see her, really see her. Perhaps for the first time in months. Perhaps for the first time since Eleanor had been the plain one, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause problems. And what Margaret found there apparently required a new response, because the one she had prepared was clearly no longer sufficient. "He won't stay interested," her mother said finally. And there it was, the truth, stripped of pretense. The thing Margaret had meant all along. "Men like that don't stay interested in women like you, Eleanor. It's a kindness to tell you." "Women like me," Eleanor said. "You know what I mean." "Tell me anyway," Eleanor said. "Say it plainly, since we're both telling the truth tonight." Margaret's mouth tightened. "Unremarkable women," she said, and the word came out sharp and cold and real, and it landed exactly where it was aimed. "He'll be kind to you for an evening because you're novel, and then he'll find someone like your sister, because men always do. And you'll have made enemies over nothing, and turned down a decent offer from a decent man, and you'll be exactly where you were before, only lonelier." Eleanor stood inside those words for a long moment, and she let them do their work, and she felt them. Because her mother was not entirely wrong about the statistics of the world, and Eleanor was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. Then she said, very quietly, "Or I won't." She turned and walked back across the floor. Benedict was where he said he'd be. He watched her come across the room toward him, and he didn't look away, and he didn't look at the ivory gown drifting near the fireplace. and when she stopped in front of him, his expression asked the question without words. "I'm all right," she said. "What did she say?" "That you'll lose interest," Eleanor said. "That you'll find someone more remarkable." He held her gaze. And I said, "Or I won't," she said. "And then I came back." The music shifted behind them, turning from the quick reel of the last set into something slower and steadier. Benedict set down his untouched glass on the nearest surface, and he held out his hand. "Second dance," he said. "You said you were economical," she said. "I am," he said. "This is exactly as many as I need." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand. Across the room, she felt her mother watching. Felt Genevieve watching. The weight of it specific and certain against the back of her neck like a held breath. She put her hand in his, and for the second time that evening, in the sight of everyone who had ever looked through her, Benedict Hawthorne led Eleanor Ashford onto the floor. And this time, every conversation in the room stopped entirely. The room did not resume its conversations. Eleanor had been at enough Virginia summer balls to know the precise quality of silence that meant people were watching rather than simply pausing. And this was that silence, the full-body kind, where even the women holding fans stopped moving them, where the musicians played on because stopping would have been more conspicuous than continuing, and where every set of eyes in the Hargrove ballroom tracked two people moving across the floor as though the rest of the evening had been a rehearsal for this exact moment. She felt it, and she did not flinch from it. "They're all staring," she said quietly. "Yes," Benedict said. "That doesn't bother you?" "Not even slightly," he said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had been thinking about most things tonight. Not the reflexive answer, not the trained one, but the true one, which sometimes took a moment to locate. "6 months ago it would have," she said. "Tonight I find I'm mostly just tired of being invisible. And these two things turn out to be incompatible." His hand tightened briefly at her back. Not a significant gesture, just present. "Good," he said. They danced without speaking for a stretch, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that didn't require filling, that existed between people who had already said the hard things and found the silence afterward easier than the silences before. Then she became aware of Genevieve. Not by looking. She didn't have to look. She had spent 24 years developing a particular sensitivity to her sister's proximity, the way you develop sensitivity to weather. A pressure change, a shift in the air, some internal signal that fired before the conscious mind caught up. Genevieve had moved to the edge of the floor. Eleanor could feel exactly where she was standing without turning her head to confirm it. "She's watching us," Eleanor said. "She has been since the first dance," Benedict said. "The difference is that she's not bothering to be subtle about it now. She's angry." "She's more than angry," he said. "She's recalculating." He said it with the same flatness he used for most things. Not cold, just precise. "Women like your sister don't get angry. They get strategic. You've known her for an evening." "I've known several versions of her," he said. "They tend to operate similarly." Eleanor absorbed that. "Is that why you came back to England? A version of her?" "No," he said. "The woman I was engaged to was nothing like your sister. She was honest about what she wanted. That's actually why I could eventually be grateful for her." He paused. "Your sister is not honest about what she wants. She dresses it as concern and wraps it in warmth, and delivers it at the moment it will do the most damage. That's a different thing entirely." "That's a very complete assessment of someone you've spoken to twice." "I watched her for 3 months tonight," he said simply. Eleanor laughed. A real one, short and startled and genuine. and she felt it move through her the way real laughter did, like something being shaken loose. Benedict looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived just to the left of one. "There it is," he said quietly. "There what is?" "That," he said. "That laugh. I've been waiting for it since you were standing against the wall at the beginning of the evening, looking like someone who had forgotten they were allowed to." She looked at him. The music moved around them. "You noticed that?" "I told you," he said. "I was paying attention." The dance ended. For a moment, neither of them moved immediately, and Eleanor was aware of the particular suspension of the moment, the music tapering, the floor around them still holding that quality of audience attention, and the two of them standing in the middle of all of it, as though they had arrived at a decision that hadn't been spoken yet. Then the applause began, which was the social machinery of the evening reasserting itself, and people began to talk again, and the spell, if it was a spell, redistributed itself into something less concentrated. Benedict released her hand, correctly, appropriately. But he did not step back the full distance that courtesy required, and Eleanor noticed that, and decided she was not going to be the one to create the gap. "I need to speak to Hargrove before the evening ends," he said. "There's a matter of the eastern road repairs that affects both our properties, and I've been avoiding it because Hargrove enjoys talking." He looked at her with something that was wry and plain-spoken in equal measure. "I will not enjoy the next 20 minutes. "You survived crop rotation," she said. "Barely," he said. "Stay near the window, the one you were at earlier. I'll find you before the evening ends." It was not a question. It was also not a command. It landed somewhere between them, as a simple statement of intention, the way he seemed to state most things, without performance or hedging, just the plain shape of what he meant. "All right," she said. He inclined his head and moved toward the far end of the room, and Eleanor watched him go, and understood that she was, for the second time this evening, standing in the middle of a ballroom, watching Benedict Hawthorne walk away, and that this time, the watching felt entirely different. Not uncertainty, not the careful tamping down of something she didn't trust yet. Something steadier than that. Something that was beginning to feel like ground. She was still standing there, still finding her footing in that feeling, when Genevieve appeared directly in front of her. Not from the side this time, not with the careful approach of a woman being strategic. Straight on, which was new, and which told Eleanor that the recalculation Benedict had predicted had concluded and arrived at a different method. "That was well done," Genevieve said. Her voice was still warm, still sisterly, but there was a thinness to it now, like fabric worn past its proper weight. "Both dances. You have his attention." "Genevieve." "I want to talk to you," Genevieve said. "Not like this. Not in the middle of everyone. Come to the hall with me for a moment." Eleanor looked at her sister, measured it. "All right," she said. The entrance hall was cooler, which was the only thing to recommend it. A few guests had drifted out for air, but the far end was empty, and Genevieve moved them there with the efficiency of a woman who had selected her location in advance. She turned to face Eleanor, and the warmth was gone. Not entirely. It never went entirely. It was too practiced for that. But it had dropped to the level where Eleanor could see clearly behind it, and what she saw was something she had spent years not letting herself name. "You've embarrassed me tonight," Genevieve said. "I've done nothing of the sort. In front of Mr. Hargrove's guests, in front of half the county, you've made it look like—" She stopped, reorganized. "You've made it look like there's something between us, some conflict." "There is something between us," Eleanor said. The silence that followed was the most honest one they'd had in years. "I don't know what you mean by that," Genevieve said. which was the first outright lie Eleanor had heard from her all evening. Because Genevieve knew exactly what Eleanor meant, had always known, would always know, and the pretense otherwise was simply the next arrangement in a long series of arrangements. "The tea," Eleanor said. One word, that was all. And she watched her sister's face with the full attention of a woman who had waited 6 months to say it, and had now decided that tonight, in the entrance hall of the Hargrove estate, was as good a time as any. Genevieve did not flinch. That was the thing about Genevieve. She never flinched. She absorbed impact the way still water absorbed a stone, closing back over it almost instantly, leaving only the smallest disturbance on the surface. "You were ill," Genevieve said carefully. "The tea helped you sleep." "Did it?" Eleanor said. "I brought it to you every night because I was worried about you." "You brought it to me every night for 3 weeks," Eleanor said. "And then you went to Richmond, and I stopped drinking the tea, and I recovered." "People recover from illness, Eleanor." Her voice was very steady. "That's what illness does." "Some illness," Eleanor agreed. "Yes." "I don't know what you're suggesting," Genevieve said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you what I know. What I've known since March. What I decided in March to let go of. Because you are my sister, and because I couldn't prove it, and because I chose to live my life instead of spending it being angry at you." She held her sister's gaze. "But I want you to know that I know. I want you to understand that when you look at me from now on, you are looking at a woman who knows." Genevieve was very still. The warmth on her face had gone entirely now, and what was underneath it was not the villain Eleanor had sometimes, in her darkest moments of the sick room, imagined. It was something more complicated and more frightening than a villain. It was a woman who had wanted something and taken it by the most convenient available method, and had never fully examined what that meant, and was only now, in this entrance hall, with Eleanor's eyes on her, beginning to. "I love you," Genevieve said, and Eleanor believed her, which was the most terrible part. She believed it completely. Genevieve loved her the way some people loved things, with full sincerity and absolutely no understanding of how that love operated in the world. "I know you do," Eleanor said. "That doesn't fix it." She turned and walked back into the ballroom, and she did not cry, which surprised her, and her hands were not shaking, which surprised her more. She had imagined that conversation 100 times in the sick room, and it had always ended with her in pieces. Instead, she felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not relief, not resolution, but the specific quality of a woman who has been carrying a weight so long she'd stopped noticing its shape, and has finally put it down, and is only now registering what her own arms feel like: empty. Clara Hartley was at the window. Not the same window, a different one, closer to the floor. And she was standing there with a cup of something, and the expression of a girl who had witnessed considerably more of the evening than anyone had meant to show her. "Are you all right?" Clara asked. "I think so," Eleanor said. "Yes. Your sister looks—" Clara glanced toward the entrance hall. "Like a woman who has just been told something she knew was coming, and still wasn't ready for." "That's accurate," Eleanor said. "And you look," Clara considered, "like someone who just walked through fire and came out the other side not entirely on fire anymore." Eleanor made a sound that was close enough to a laugh. "Also accurate." "He's still talking to Hargrove," Clara said, with the cheerful information sharing of someone who had been tracking everyone's movements all evening. "About the roads. Hargrove just used his hands to demonstrate something, which means it'll be at least another 10 minutes. Eleanor looked across the room. Benedict was indeed still in the far corner with their host, enduring what appeared to be an enthusiastic explanation of something involving considerable gesture. As she watched, he turned his head, found her across the room with the particular accuracy of a man who knew exactly where she was. And something in his expression settled. Not relief, but the specific easing of a man who had been half attending to a conversation and half attending to something else, and was now confirmed in the thing he'd been half attending to. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to Clara. "He keeps finding you in a room," Clara said, with the frank observation of the very young. "Even when he's not looking, he's looking." "You notice a great deal," Eleanor said. "I'm 17, Clara said. "I have no power over anything, and so I have learned to pay attention to everything. It's the only currency available to me." She paused. "When I'm older, and I have choices, I want to make them the way you made them tonight." Eleanor looked at her. "I've done nothing remarkable tonight." "You said no to being arranged," Clara said. "You said a true thing to your sister that I could see from 20 feet away was true and hard and overdue. And you danced twice with the only man in this room who behaved like a person instead of a performance. And you did it in the sight of everyone who's ever looked through you." She took a sip of her drink. "That's remarkable. I don't know why women keep being told it isn't." Eleanor did not have a response to that. She stood with it, and with the window's slight movement of air against her face. And she thought that sometimes the most clarifying things were said by 17-year-olds who had nothing to lose. Her mother found her again at 9:30. Eleanor braced for it. She had been bracing since the last conversation ended, waiting for the next round, steeling herself for the Margaret Ashford version of a final argument, which tended to be the most surgical variety because her mother had the most data. But Margaret did not arrive with fury. She arrived with something that Eleanor recognized, after a moment, as a woman who had recalculated in a direction she hadn't planned. "Mr. Colby is leaving," Margaret said. Flat. No warmth, no performance. "He sends his regards." "That's kind of him," Eleanor said. He said you were direct." A pause. "He didn't say it badly." Eleanor waited. "Hawthorne has spoken to Hargrove for 40 minutes, Margaret said. "People have noticed." "I'm sure they have." "They've also noticed that he spent the majority of the evening, the parts he wasn't speaking to Hargrove, near you." Her mother's voice had the quality of someone reading a ledger, adding up figures, arriving at a number she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Hargrove asked me about you, about your situation, your health, whether you had any—" She stopped. "Any prospects," Eleanor supplied. "Yes." The word sat between them. Eleanor let it sit. "What did you tell her?" Eleanor asked. "I told her you were in excellent health," Margaret said stiffly, "and that you were—" Another stop, longer this time. "That you were a great deal more than people had given you credit for." Eleanor turned to look at her mother. Margaret Ashford was not a woman who made admissions easily. She was not a woman who reversed course in public or apologized in private. And what she had just said was not an apology, not precisely, but it was the closest thing to one that Eleanor had heard from her since childhood, and it had clearly cost something to produce. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. Margaret looked away. "Don't make something large out of something small," she said, which was her mother's way of saying, "I mean it, but I can't afford to mean it too loudly." "I won't," Eleanor said. They stood beside each other in something that was not comfort and was not war, which was, Eleanor thought, more than they had managed in years. It was Benedict who ended it. Not the evening. The evening had its own momentum, rolling toward 10 o'clock with the particular energy of a Virginia summer ball winding down. the music slowing, the older guests beginning to make their departures, the younger ones clustering in the way that suggested plans were being made for the days ahead. He came to find her exactly when he said he would, before the evening ended, and he came directly, without circling, without performing the social ritual of arriving casually. He simply walked to where she was and stopped. "Hargrove," he said, "has opinions about drainage. Are you better informed now?" "I am considerably better informed, and considerably less interested in ever being informed again," he said. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which she was beginning to understand was a significant thing. Not because it was flattering, but because it was rare. This was a man who did not give his attention cheaply. "How was the rest of the evening?" "Eventful," she said. "Your sister?" "We spoke," Eleanor said. It needed to happen. It was long overdue." He nodded, not pressing. "And your mother?" "Also spoke. Less explosively than I expected." "Progress," he said. "Of a kind," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when he was moving towards something he intended to say honestly. She had learned this about him in the space of one evening, which was perhaps the strangest part of all of it. How quickly she had learned his particular rhythms, his tells, the way he breathed before saying something that mattered. You didn't learn those things about people you hadn't been paying attention to. Which meant she had been paying attention to him as carefully as he had been paying attention to her. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "at Ashford House, if you're agreeable." Eleanor was very still. "A formal call." "A formal call," he confirmed, "with whatever chaperone your mother requires, and however many of Hargrove's neighbors happen to be walking past your gate when I arrive, so that the entire county knows within the week." He said it without irony. He meant it practically. He was the kind of man who understood that women had reputations that needed managing. Not because he thought that was fair, but because he understood the world he lived in and navigated it accordingly. "I want to do this correctly, whatever this is." "You don't know yet what it is," she said. "No," he said. "That's exactly why I want to call, to find out." He held her gaze. "You deserve someone who wants to find out, Eleanor. Not someone who arrives with conclusions already drawn." She heard her mother's voice from earlier that evening. "He'll lose interest. Men like that don't stay interested in women like you." And she let it move through her and out the other side, because she had been carrying her mother's predictions about her future for too long, and they had not served her, and she was done with them. "Yes," she said, "you may call." Something in him eased, not visibly, not dramatically, but she felt it, the way you felt a held breath released in a small room. "Thursday," he said, "if that suits." "Thursday suits." He held out his hand, not for a dance this time, just offered, open. A gesture that had no specific social function except the function of being an offered hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put her hand in his, and he held it briefly, with the same pressure as the dancing, which was correct and warm, and said more in restraint than most men said in volume. "Good evening, Miss Ashford," he said. "Good evening, Benedict," she said. He released her hand and moved toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who had done what he came to do, and Eleanor watched him go and did not feel the deflation she had been half waiting for all evening. The inevitable collapse of the thing she hadn't let herself entirely believe in. What she felt was Thursday. The carriage ride home was quiet. Her mother sat across from her with her hands folded in her lap and her face angled toward the dark window. And Genevieve sat beside Margaret with her eyes down and her expression unreadable in the poor light. And Eleanor sat on her side of the carriage and looked at neither of them, and did not feel the need to. They were halfway home when Genevieve spoke. "He's going to call on Thursday," she said. Not a question. She must have heard it, had probably been standing close enough to hear most of the evening, Eleanor understood now. Had been close enough for most of it, by design. "Yes," Eleanor said. Genevieve was quiet. Then, "He chose well." It was the most unguarded thing her sister had said all night. Eleanor looked at her. In the poor carriage light, Genevieve looked younger than she usually did. Less arranged, less performing. Something tired around the edges of her face that might, in a different version of the story, have been grief. "Genevieve," Eleanor started. "Don't," Genevieve said quietly. "Not tonight. I'm not ready." Eleanor looked at her sister. This woman she had loved and been diminished by, and survived. This complicated, beautiful, frightening person who had handed her poison tea with genuine affection, and would probably never entirely understand why that was what it was. And she said nothing. Because Genevieve was right. Not tonight. Margaret said nothing at all for the remainder of the drive. Eleanor leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. And she thought about a man who had crossed a ballroom because she looked like someone who had already handled most of it on her own. And she thought about Thursday. And she thought about the long, strange, brutal, necessary work of becoming the version of yourself you had always been, underneath everything that had been placed on top of you. She had danced twice tonight. She had said true things to people who needed to hear them. She had put her hand in an outstretched hand and not pulled it back. She had survived the winter and come out into the summer, and the summer was warmer than she remembered, and the road home was dark, and Thursday was 4 days away, and Eleanor Ashford was, for the first time in as long as she could honestly recall, looking forward to what came next. Thursday came with the particular slowness of days that matter. Eleanor had not slept well on Wednesday night, which she attributed to the heat and not to anything else, because attributing it to anything else felt like the kind of admission that required more certainty than she currently possessed. She had lain in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and told herself, with measured practicality, that a man calling on a woman was a common enough event and did not warrant the specific quality of attention her heartbeat had been giving it since she woke up. Her heartbeat was not persuaded. She was at the writing desk in the front parlor when she heard the carriage on the road, and she did not move to the window, because moving to the window was the kind of thing a woman did when she was expecting someone in a way she was not prepared to admit to. And Eleanor Ashford had rebuilt herself on honesty over the past several months, but there were limits. Then the knock at the door, and the maid's footsteps in the hall, and voices, Benedict's, even and unhurried, giving his name to someone who already knew it, because Margaret Ashford had told every person in the house approximately 40 times since Tuesday that a visitor was expected Thursday, and the front parlor was to be clean, and the good tea service was to be used, and nobody was to say anything embarrassing. Her mother appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman performing composure. "He's here," she said. "I heard," Eleanor said. "Your hair is fine," Eleanor said, and stood. He was standing in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and when Eleanor came in, he looked at her the same way he had looked at her across the ballroom on Saturday, directly, without the social softening that men usually applied when they were performing interest rather than feeling it. Just straight at her, as though she were the thing he had come to see, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Duke Hawthorne," she said. And then, because her mother was 3 feet away and watching everything, "Please come in." They sat in the front parlor, with its good tea service and its open window, and Margaret Ashford positioned in the corner chair with the determined presence of a woman fulfilling her chaperoning duty while making it clear she was also listening to every word. Eleanor had expected this. She had made her peace with it on the carriage ride home Saturday night, when she had understood that the work ahead was not one large gesture, but a series of smaller, consistent ones, conducted under full observation of everyone who had an opinion about how her life should be arranged. Benedict accepted the tea with the politeness of a man who understood the ritual without requiring it. He sat with the relaxed posture of someone who was comfortable in his own frame, which Eleanor had noticed at the ball and was noticing again now. He did not perform ease. He simply had it, which was rarer than it looked. "I've been thinking," he said, when the tea had been poured and the social formalities executed, "about what you said Saturday, about the winter." Eleanor was aware of her mother's attention sharpening in the corner. "Have you?" she said carefully. "I've been thinking about it in the specific context of your current situation," he said. "Your household, your—" he chose the word with precision. "Dependencies." It was the most oblique he had been with her, which meant he was aware of the third person in the room and was navigating accordingly. Eleanor appreciated it. "My situation is stable," she said. "Is it?" he said, and it was not quite a question. She looked at him. He looked back. The conversation they were having underneath the conversation they were having passed between them in about 3 seconds. "It's improving," she said. "Good," he said. He set down the teacup. "I'd like to make it more so." Margaret Ashford made a sound in the corner that was not quite a word and was not quite a breath. He stayed an hour and a half. He came back on Saturday and again the following Tuesday, and by the second week even Margaret had stopped staging herself quite so obviously in the corner, allowing herself to drift gradually toward the farther chair, and then the chair near the window, and then, on the third Tuesday, the adjacent room entirely, which was technically a failure of her chaperoning duty, and which Eleanor suspected was the closest her mother would ever get to a deliberate concession. The calls were proper. They talked, really talked, the way Eleanor had not talked to anyone in years, the way she hadn't been certain she knew how to until Saturday night in a candlelit parlor with Mrs. Whitmore pretending not to listen. They talked about his father and hers. They talked about England, which he described with the precise mixture of respect and frustration of someone who had genuinely learned from a place and had also genuinely been ready to leave it. They talked about the estate, about the land, about the ways Virginia had changed since the war and the ways it hadn't. They talked about books. He read widely, with the slightly apologetic thoroughness of a man who had been told by someone at some point that his range of interest was unusual, and had decided the someone was wrong. She matched him, and the look on his face the first time she challenged one of his interpretations was the look of a man who had been handed something he hadn't known he was hungry for. "You disagree," he said, on the second Tuesday, about something a philosopher had written about the nature of grief. "Entirely," she said. "He writes about grief as though it's a passage, something you move through and arrive out the other side of. But that's not what it is. It's more like it becomes part of the material you're made of. You don't arrive out the other side. You become someone for whom that grief is one of the components." He was quiet for a moment. "That's better than anything he wrote," he said. "Don't tell him," she said. "He's been dead 40 years, Benedict said. "I think you're safe." Eleanor laughed, and it was easier now, the laughing. It came without the startled quality it had carried at the ball, without the sense of something unfamiliar being used. It was just hers. Genevieve did not appear during the calls. This was, Eleanor understood, a deliberate choice. The house was not large enough for Genevieve not to know when Benedict arrived and how long he stayed. And the silence of her absence spoke the way deliberate silences always did. Not as resolution, but as a position being held. A woman regrouping in private. They had not spoken again about the winter. Not directly. There had been a morning, 9 days after the ball, when Eleanor had come down to find Genevieve already at breakfast, and they had sat across from each other with a particular careful courtesy of two people inhabiting a shared space that had been rearranged and had not yet settled into its new configuration. Genevieve had poured Eleanor's tea, not chamomile. She had poured the same strong black tea she poured for herself, without comment, without flourish, without any of the performance that had accompanied the chamomile all those dark winter evenings. Eleanor had looked at her cup, then at her sister. Genevieve met her eyes for a moment, direct, unguarded, the warmth absent in a way that was not coldness, but was simply the absence of the performance. And then she looked back at her plate. Eleanor drank the tea. It was not forgiveness. Eleanor was clear-eyed enough about herself to know that it was not going to be forgiveness in any simple or rapid sense, that the winter lived in her body in ways she was still discovering. That trust, once broken at that particular depth, took years to rebuild and might, honestly, never rebuild entirely. She was not going to tell herself it was forgiveness. But it was a cup of the right tea. And sometimes, she was learning, that was where things had to start. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the ball. It was not from Benedict. She had seen Benedict the previous Tuesday and would see him again the following week. And the rhythm of their calls had developed its own dependable shape, which was itself a thing she was still learning to trust. The dependability of it. The way he kept arriving without requiring her to brace for the arrival. The letter was from Mrs. Hargrove, which surprised Eleanor enough that she read it twice before the full meaning assembled itself. Mrs. Hargrove wrote to invite her, specifically her, not her mother, not the family, but Eleanor, to a small gathering the following Friday. A dinner, not a ball. 8 guests. Mrs. Hargrove wrote that she had been meaning to know Eleanor better for some time, and that recent events had reminded her of the value of not postponing the things one meant to do. Recent events. It was the most delicate possible reference to the fact that Benedict Hawthorne had danced twice with Eleanor Ashford and had since been calling on her twice a week, and that this information had traveled through the county at the speed social information always traveled, which was faster than a horse. Eleanor set the letter down, picked it up, read it a 3rd time. Her mother appeared in the doorway. "What is it?" Eleanor handed her the letter. Margaret read it again. Her expression moved through several states in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been pride and was fighting to stay neutral. And then she set the letter on the table, with the particular care of a woman handling something she didn't want to misplace. "Mrs. Hargrove," Margaret said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She's inviting you to dinner." "Yes." "Specifically you." "Specifically me," Eleanor said. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, carefully, without looking at Eleanor directly, "You'll need something for your hair. The braid was fine for the ball. A dinner wants something different." It was the most maternal thing Margaret Ashford had said to her in years. Not the performance of mothering, not the management of Eleanor's presentation for Margaret's social purposes, but the plain, practical attention of a woman thinking about her daughter's evening. "I'll figure something out," Eleanor said. "I have pearl pins," her mother said. "Your grandmother's. They were always meant to go to you." A pause, barely perceptible. I kept meaning to give them to you. I should have given them to you before now. Eleanor looked at her mother, at the rigidness that was slightly less rigid today, at the hands that were not folded in the management posture, but simply resting, and she thought about the long, inexact work of two women who had failed each other in specific and different ways, trying to figure out how to be in the same room without the armor. "I'd like that," Eleanor said. "The pins." Margaret nodded, once, and left the room, and Eleanor let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 weeks. The dinner was Friday. Benedict arrived at the Hargrove house from his own estate, and they were seated across from each other at Mrs. Hargrove's table, which Eleanor suspected was not accidental, and the candlelight was lower and warmer than it had been at the ball, and the conversation moved the way dinner conversations moved, between 8 people who were there by genuine invitation, with space for real things to be said. Mrs. Hargrove was, it turned out, a sharper and more interesting woman than her role as county social arbiter suggested. She had opinions. She expressed them without excessive decoration. She watched Benedict and Eleanor across her dinner table with the expression of a woman who had arranged the specific seating deliberately and was satisfied with the result. "You've been calling regularly," Mrs. Hargrove said to Benedict over the soup course, with the directness of a woman who had reached the age where she no longer felt the need to approach things sideways. "I have," Benedict said. "Good," Mrs. Hargrove said, and moved on to the bread. And that was the entirety of it, which Eleanor found she appreciated enormously. After dinner, the guests moved to the adjacent room, and in the reorganizing of the evening's geography, Eleanor found herself near the far window. Not the same window as the ball, but a window, because apparently she was developing a consistent relationship with the perimeter of rooms, and Benedict came to stand beside her with the inevitability of a man who knew where he was going before he started moving. "Mrs. Hargrove has opinions," Eleanor said. "She thinks highly of you," he said. "She told me so, on Tuesday, when she extended the invitation." "She told you about the invitation before she sent it to me?" "She wanted to know if I had objections," he said. "She's known me since I was 12. She feels entitled to consult me on most things." "And did you?" Eleanor asked. "Have objections?" He looked at her as though the question were slightly absurd. "I told her it was the best idea she'd had since I arrived home," he said. Eleanor looked at him in the way she'd been looking at him for 3 weeks now, with the quiet, accumulating knowledge of someone who had been paying attention every time and was beginning to understand the full shape of what she was looking at. Not the idea of him, not the title, not the evening, not the gesture of a man crossing a ballroom. The actual person, the one who endured crop rotation without complaint, and read widely, and said true things plainly, and showed up twice a week without requiring her to perform anything at all. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said at the ball, about wanting someone who didn't want something from you, that had more to do with your title than with you." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I have thought about your title, deliberately, and examined my own feelings about it carefully, because I think that's the honest thing to do." "And?" he said. "And the honest conclusion is that I don't care about it," she said. "Not because it's irrelevant, but because it's not the thing I find myself thinking about when I think about you. I think about the dinner conversation, and the way you listened, and the fact that you noticed my father's dress on my sister before I said a word about it. Those are the things." She paused. "I wanted to say that plainly, because you said you wanted plain." Benedict looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was the thing she had learned to watch for. Not the performed warmth of social engagement, but the real version. The one that lived underneath all the disengagement and came out only when something had genuinely gotten through. Eleanor, he said. Yes, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer the same way you just said that. All right, she said. Do you want this? He said. Not the idea of it, not what it solves or what it provides, or what it would mean to your mother or the county. Do you want this, what's between us, for itself? She did not hesitate. Yes, she said. I want it for itself. I have wanted it since you told me I didn't look rested, and it was the truest thing anyone had said to me in 6 months. She breathed. I'm not asking you to move fast. I'm not asking you for anything before you're ready to give it. I'm just answering you plainly. He nodded slowly, and the something in him that had been careful and measured and watchful for 3 weeks eased in a way she could feel from where she was standing, like a door that had been held against weather, finally allowed to rest. I have a question of my own, she said. Ask it. In England, she said, when the engagement ended, when she went to Scotland. She watched him. Did you grieve? The actual woman, not the arrangement? No, he said, without hesitation. And that told me more than anything else about what it had actually been. He paused. I've been paying attention, since then, to the difference between things I would grieve and things I wouldn't. And? She said. And, he said quietly, you are very clearly in the first category. The window's air moved between them, warm with summer, and Eleanor stood inside the specific feeling of being known, not idealized, not arranged, not managed toward a version of herself that served someone else's purpose, simply known, by a person who had come looking for the truth of her and had not been disappointed by what he found. Thursday, she said. I'll be there, he said. She told no one about that conversation, not Clara Hartley, who would have catalogued it with delighted precision. Not her mother, who would have immediately begun calculating what it meant for the calendar. Not anyone. She held it the way you held things that were still becoming, carefully, with room around them, without pressing for the shape before it was ready to show itself. What she did tell Clara, in a note the following week, was simply that the dinner had gone well. Clara wrote back, in the loose handwriting of a girl who had too many thoughts for the speed of her pen. I knew it. I knew it from the first dance. Some things are obvious to everyone except the people inside them. I'm glad you got there. I'm glad he did too. Tell me everything when you can. Eleanor folded the note and put it in the writing desk beside her father's old letters, which was where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find again. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of summer moving toward its fullest heat. Slow in the best way. The way things were slow when they had enough room to develop properly. When no one was pressing them into a shape before they were ready. Benedict called on Thursdays and Tuesdays. He stopped holding the untouched glass. She noticed that specifically, the first Thursday she saw him take an actual drink of something. And the absence of that specific, studied distance moved her in a way she wouldn't have expected from so small a thing. It was the kind of detail that only mattered if you had been paying attention all along. Her mother gave her the pearl pins. They were smaller than Eleanor had imagined from childhood memory. She had seen them in a grandmother's hair at formal occasions, and they had seemed enormous then, the way everything seemed enormous when you were small. In her own hands, they were delicate, 3 seed pearls on each, set in silver that had gone slightly dark with age. She turned them over in her palm and thought about her grandmother wearing them, and her mother choosing not to wear them for years and years, holding them for a daughter she had not always known how to love correctly. She put them in her hair on a Tuesday and came downstairs, and her mother looked at her from across the hall and said nothing at all, which was its own language, and Eleanor understood it perfectly. It was on a Thursday in August, 6 weeks after the ball, with the summer at its fullest, and the roses outside the parlor window doing whatever roses did when no one asked them to be anything other than roses, that Benedict arrived with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Eleanor knew it before he spoke. She had been learning the architecture of his expressions for 6 weeks, and this one was specific. Not the careful steadiness he wore when navigating social terrain, not the working quiet of someone processing something difficult, but the open, settled expression of a man who has arrived at a true thing and is about to say it. "Eleanor," he said. Her mother was in the adjacent room, specifically not listening. "I know I said I didn't want to move fast," he said. "I know we agreed there was no pressure and no calendar and no expectation." He held her gaze. "I want to tell you that I meant all of that, and I still mean it. And nothing I'm about to say requires an immediate answer, or any answer by any particular time." "All right," she said. "I am also going to say it," he said, "because you are the most honest person I have met in 31 years of life, and the least I can do is be equally honest with you." "Say it," she said. "I love you," he said. Plain, undecorated, the same way he had told her at the ball that she didn't look rested, with the same quiet, matter-of-fact certainty of a man stating something that was simply, observably true. "I have loved you since approximately the moment you told me that you chose to live your life, instead of spending it angry. And I would very much like to spend the rest of mine next to yours, if you'll allow it." The summer pressed against the window. Somewhere in the hall, something shifted. Her mother, probably, rearranging herself with the elaborate casualness of a woman who had absolutely not heard anything. Eleanor looked at Benedict Hawthorne, who had crossed a room for her before he knew her name, who had endured crop rotation and drainage opinions and Tuesday afternoons with her mother sitting in the corner, who had noticed the dress and the weight she'd lost and the way she breathed before she said something hard, who had asked her what she wanted and listened to the answer, and then shown up again the following Thursday anyway. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the parlor, probably, which I'm aware is very fast. And I decided sometime in the second week to stop apologizing for how fast it happened, because it happened, and it is real, and I am done minimizing real things." He smiled. A full one, genuine, no left-of-center approximation. The real thing, and it changed his whole face, opened it up, made him look years younger and infinitely more himself. "Then we're agreed," he said. "We're agreed," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and her mother in the adjacent room made a sound that was either a suppressed sob or a suppressed declaration of victory, and Eleanor suspected it was both, and she found she didn't mind either way. She had survived the winter that was meant to quiet her. She had walked into the summer on her own terms, in her grandmother's pearl pins, in a green dress that was not the ivory one, and she had stood at the edge of a room full of people who had never properly looked at her. And the one person who had looked, and looked again, and kept looking, and chosen what he saw. Eleanor Ashford had spent 24 years learning to disappear, and she had spent one summer learning, finally and completely, that she had never needed to.